I have been a scanner officer for 19 years. I have read contacts the way other people read weather, intuitively, without thought, the numbers translating themselves into meaning before I am conscious of having looked at them. 19 years of patrol duty along the Oreth Compact's rimward borders, where the dead systems outnumber the living ones, and the only things that move are survey drones, wayward debris, and the occasional civilian prospector who has wandered past the marker buoys without reading the notices. 19 years of nothing. I tell you this not to explain what I missed. I tell you this to explain why what I saw on the 43rd day of the Quiet Ledger's patrol rotation should have been immediately obvious to me. Because what came up from beneath the ecliptic plane of the Vorethnal dead star on that day was not subtle. It was not disguised. It had made no attempt whatsoever to hide its approach. It simply rose, the way a thing rises when it has been somewhere very deep for a very long time and has finally decided to stop staying there. I saw it first as a thermal gradient, a warmth that did not belong in the dead system's profile, rising from below the ecliptic plane at a bearing of roughly 22 degrees off the stellar remnant's south pole. Vorethnal had been a yellow dwarf before it burned out, and what remained of it now was a cold, dense mass, barely the size of a large moon, surrounded by the debris rings of planets that had never finished forming. Nothing should have been warm in Vorethnal. Nothing had been warm in Vorethnal for 400,000 years. The system appeared in our survey registers as dormant, an empty box ticked, the kind of entry that signals to a border patrol that there is nothing to do here, nothing to watch, nothing that will require a report. I noted the thermal gradient in the passive log. That is what I did. I noted it passively, the way you note a slightly unusual cloud formation when you are not expecting rain. The contact firmed up over the next 14 minutes. The thermal signature grew, not the sharp spike of a thruster burn, but the slow, building warmth of a reactor that has been running at low output for a very long time and is now gradually increasing its draw. Like something waking up from a deep sleep, like something that had been running on minimum power for so long that the act of increasing output was a mechanical process rather than a decision. The reactor was not powering up. It had been powered up. It was merely running harder. I brought it to Secondary Officer Drathvel's attention at minute 16. She looked at my screen for a moment, then at her own panel, then back at mine. She asked if I had cross-referenced the contact against the system's survey files. I had. Vorethnal's survey file was 400 years old. The system had been entered as empty, lifeless, of no strategic interest. The survey had been conducted by a single drone pass, which was standard practice for dead systems in this region of the Compact's rimward territory. I told her all of this. She listened in the way experienced officers listen to information that does not yet resolve into anything they need to act on, with attention but without alarm. Then she asked me to cross-reference the hull signature. This was when the first interesting thing happened. The contact was now close enough that our long-range array was beginning to resolve a shape from the thermal bloom, a dense mass, large, with a profile that did not match any of the survey drones in our operational logs, any of the prospector configurations in our civilian registry, or any of the Compact's own vessels currently assigned to this patrol sector. The shape was large. Larger than the Quiet Ledger, which is itself a mid-tonnage border frigate with a crew of 62. Considerably larger. Our array was still resolving the full dimensions, but the partial profile was already suggesting something in excess of 4 kilometers along its primary axis, which placed it in a hull class I did not often encounter at this posting. Drathvel ran the hull signature through the Compact's full vessel registry while I continued to watch the contact rise. It was ascending steadily, following the natural line of the ecliptic plane as though it intended to clear the debris rings and continue into the upper system. Its velocity was increasing. Not dramatically, not in the manner of an evasive burn or a rapid approach. It was accelerating the way a very large, very heavy object accelerates when it has decided on a direction. Methodically. Without urgency. The registry return came back in 40 seconds. I have served under 3 commanding officers in 19 years, and all of them have used the same phrase when a situation develops that does not match any known pattern. They say, "We have a file on that." It is the compact's default posture toward the unfamiliar. The Orth compact has been cataloging the known galaxy for 900 years, and in those 900 years we have accumulated a registry of every vessel type, every species, every hull configuration, every weapon signature, every propulsion system that any spacefaring civilization has produced. We do not encounter things we do not have a file on. The archive is comprehensive. The archive is, by the compact's institutional definition, complete. The registry had a file on the contact. Drathvel read the entry aloud in a tone that I can only describe as the voice of someone who has found something in an old box and is not yet certain whether it is reassuring or alarming. The hull signature matched, within a confidence interval of 94%, a human-built deep space combat vessel of the Perdition-class dreadnought series. The Perdition class had been produced by the human civilization approximately 700 years ago, in the period preceding what the compact's history files called the consolidation of human space. A period we had catalogued thoroughly, because it was the period during which humans had first made sustained contact with compact territory, and the compact had needed to assess whether they constituted a strategic concern. The assessment at the time had concluded: moderate capability, limited reach, no immediate threat posture. The file on this specific vessel, cross-referenced by the hull profile's dimensional signature, which matched one recorded contact from a compact survey mission 603 years ago, identified it as the S Abyssal Compact. The name was the first thing that struck me, though I did not have the context to understand it yet. The compact survey mission had encountered the vessel in low orbit around Vorethnol's third planetary remnant, which at the time had still retained a thin atmosphere. The survey mission had scanned it. The scan had showed no power output, no crew life signs, no active systems. The hull had appeared to be in a state of advanced decay consistent with several centuries of neglect. The survey report had classified the vessel as decommissioned, a human warship that had either been abandoned or positioned here deliberately as some kind of marker or territorial claim, and had noted it in the dead system's profile as a passive surface feature of no operational significance. Decommissioned. That was the word in the file. That was the single word between us, and what was currently rising from below the ecliptic plane of the Vorethnol system at an increasing velocity, reactor output climbing, hull profile resolving with every passing minute into something that filled more and more of my sensor array. I asked Drathvel whether we should notify the patrol fleet. She said yes. Then she said it again, because she had apparently not heard herself say it the first time. Commander Vethosrau received our contact report on the patrol fleet's command channel 11 minutes later. The quiet ledger was the closest vessel to the contact, which was a function of our position in the patrol rotation rather than any deliberate strategic placement. The patrol fleet for this sector consisted of 7 vessels: the quiet ledger, 2 heavy interdictors, 3 mid-tonnage frigates, and the flagship, the Orth Meridian, which was a full combat cruiser with a crew of 440 and weapon systems designed for sustained engagement rather than border patrol. The Orth Meridian was approximately 90 minutes away at standard intercept velocity. Commander Vethosrau reviewed the contact report and the registry entry in silence for a moment that I timed, because I had nothing else to do with my hands. It was 44 seconds. Then he said, "A decommissioned Hulk." He said it the way you say something when you are testing how it sounds. I told him it was reading as active. The reactor output was now unmistakable. It was not the output of a vessel in distress or a vessel that had just experienced a system restart. It was the output of a vessel running at full operational draw across multiple systems: propulsion, weapons, navigation, life support, and several system signatures I did not immediately recognize, which would turn out to be relevant later. Vethos Rao asked me to confirm the registry classification. Decommissioned, I told him. He considered this for a moment, and then made a decision that I believe was reasonable given the information available. He said the contact would be approached by the two nearest frigates, the 7th Survey and the Outer Mark, and that they were to broadcast on all standard communication bands, identify themselves as Orith compact patrol vessels, and request the contact's vessel identification and crew manifest. He said the quiet ledger was to maintain position and continue sensor observation. He said the Orith meridian would continue toward the contact at standard intercept velocity, which he characterized as a precautionary measure rather than a tactical posture. I told him I understood. Then I turned back to my sensor array and watched the abyssal compact continue to rise. It cleared the last of Vorethnol's debris rings 40 minutes after I had first noted the thermal gradient. By this point I had a complete dimensional picture, and I had spent 37 minutes looking at it. I had looked at it long enough that it had stopped being numbers and had become a shape in my mind, something I could rotate and examine and understand in 3 dimensions rather than as a set of data points. I want to be clear about what I saw, because I think clarity is the only honest tribute I can offer. The abyssal compact was 4 kilometers and 600 meters along its primary axis. It was approximately 1 kilometer and 200 meters at its widest cross-section, which was somewhere in the forward third of the hull, and it tapered into a dense, angular stern configuration that housed the primary propulsion system. It had the silhouette of something that had been designed for a single purpose, and had been designed for that purpose extremely thoroughly. Not the smooth functional elegance of a contemporary compact cruiser, but a brutal, layered architecture of armor plating and weapons housings, and reinforced structural elements that gave the impression of a vessel that expected to be hit by considerable force, and expected to continue operating afterward. The hull plating was scored in long parallel grooves that I could now resolve clearly enough to identify as weapons scarring. Not the scarring of a vessel that had been abandoned to decay, but the scarring of a vessel that had been in combat. The plating was discolored in irregular patterns across much of the forward section. Several hull panels were mismatched in a way that suggested field repairs conducted at speed, the replacements not quite matching the original material in reflectivity or texture. There were places where the original plating appeared to have been simply reinforced, rather than replaced, additional material, welded over the damage in a manner that was entirely functional and entirely unconcerned with aesthetics. The weapons housings were active. This was the thing I had been watching for 20 minutes and had not yet reported, because I had been hoping I was misreading the data. I was not. Every visible weapon emplacement on the abyssal compact, and there were many of them, mounted in a configuration that suggested the vessel was designed to maintain a weapons envelope in every direction simultaneously, was reading as fully charged and tracking capable. Not active in the sense of targeting. Active in the sense of being ready to target at any moment, without additional preparation time. The weapons had not powered up when the vessel began its ascent. They had already been powered up. They had been powered up, I would later calculate from the thermal history in my sensor logs, for at least 11 hours before I first detected the thermal gradient. They had been powered up and waiting before we knew the vessel was moving. I filed this as an addendum to the contact report and sent it to Commander Vethos Rao. He received it at approximately the same time that the 7th Survey and the Outer Mark moved to within hailing distance of the abyssal compact, and began broadcasting their identification and requests for response on the standard communication bands. The Abyssal Compact did not respond on the standard communication bands. The Abyssal Compact did not respond on any communication band. The Abyssal Compact continued on its current heading at its current velocity, which by this point was substantial. Not the velocity of a vessel that had just powered up, but the velocity of a vessel that had been accelerating continuously for some time before we noticed it, which suggested that the reactor warmth I had detected as a thermal gradient was not the beginning of its power-up sequence, but a point somewhere in the middle of it. It had been running longer than we knew. It had been running before I saw it. It had been running before I woke that morning and took my station and entered the 43rd day's routine log entries and noted the dead system and the empty patrol sector and the nothing that surrounded us in every direction. The 7th survey broadcast for 9 minutes. Then its captain, a veteran officer named Orath Vel, who had been on border patrol duty for longer than most of his crew had been alive, made a decision that I believe I would also have made, because the alternative was to let the contact pass unchallenged into compact territory, and that was not a decision that any compact patrol captain could make and remain a patrol captain. He moved the 7th survey across the Abyssal Compact's path. Not in an aggressive posture, Orath Vel was too experienced for that. The 7th survey positioned itself at a distance of approximately 40 kilometers off the contact's bow, which is the standard intercept position for challenging an unresponsive vessel. It is a position that says, you must stop and identify yourself or navigate around us, and either response will tell us something about your intentions. The outer mark took up a flanking position 3 kilometers to the 7th survey's port side. Together, the two frigates formed a checkpoint. The Abyssal Compact did not navigate around them. The first weapon discharge came from a system I had been watching in my sensor array and had been unable to classify. I had it logged as an active but unidentified weapon system, which I had marked for follow-up analysis after the contact situation resolved. I did not have time for follow-up analysis. The discharge was brief, not the sustained output of a weapons system firing a long engagement, but a single, very precisely aimed pulse of energy that lasted approximately 3/4 of a second and was directed at the 7th survey's primary propulsion array. The 7th survey's primary propulsion array ceased to function. The vessel was not destroyed. It was disabled with what would later be assessed by the repair teams that reached it 40 hours afterward as surgical precision. The propulsion array had been neutralized. The rest of the ship was intact. Orath Vel and his crew were alive. The weapon had hit exactly what it had aimed at and nothing else. The outer mark opened fire immediately. This was also the correct response. A compact frigate under attack, or under witness of attack on a companion vessel, is required by standing orders to respond with full defensive weapons. The outer mark's weapons were conventional by current compact standards, high-yield plasma projectors designed for sustained engagement, with a range and accuracy profile appropriate for border interdiction work. The outer mark fired 11 times over the course of approximately 40 seconds before the Abyssal Compact's second weapons system became relevant. The second weapons system was not surgical. It was not unidentified. It was a weapons signature I recognized from the historical catalogs, a mass driver configuration, the kind of system that human warships of the Perdition class had been documented carrying in the period before the consolidation. The mass driver had been listed in the Abyssal Compact's registry entry as part of its original armament. What the registry entry had not noted, because the survey that created the entry had been conducted on what appeared to be a decommissioned and non-operational vessel, was that the mass driver was apparently still fully functional and had been maintained to a standard that its 11 plasma projector strike marks on the hull plating, which I could now see clearly in my sensor data, had done nothing to alter. The outer mark was struck by 3 sequential mass driver projectiles over the course of roughly 12 seconds. I tracked all 3 impacts on my sensor array. The first impact was to the forward sensor array. The second was to the main weapons cluster amidships. The third was to the hull at a point that my systems identified as the junction between the primary reactor housing and the main structural spine. The outer mark went from a functioning combat vessel to a debris field in approximately 45 seconds. There were no life sign readings from what remained. I was still reporting this to Commander Vethos Rao when the abyssal compact passed the position where the 7th survey had been maintaining its intercept, adjusted its heading by approximately half a degree, not to avoid the 7th survey's disabled hull, which it passed at a distance of several kilometers, but in a correction that suggested its navigation system was accounting for some feature of the system's gravitational topology that I could not immediately identify, and continued on its original heading, into compact territory toward the core systems. I have spent a great deal of time, in the period between that moment and this one, trying to construct a version of the following events in which the compact's response was adequate. I have not succeeded. I want to be honest about this. I'm not saying the response was wrong or that the officers involved made poor decisions. I am saying that the response was adequate for the vessel described in the registry entry, and the vessel described in the registry entry was not the vessel we were dealing with. The registry entry described a decommissioned hulk of a 700-year-old warship class. The vessel we were dealing with was the abyssal compact. Commander Vethos Rao ordered the remaining 4 vessels of the patrol fleet, the 2 heavy interdictors, 1 frigate, and the Orith Meridian, to form a defensive line at the boundary coordinates that marked the formal edge of the rimward dead zone and the beginning of compact patrol space. The quiet ledger was to hold position and continue sensor observation. He did not order me to stop watching. I did not stop watching. The abyssal compact took 11 minutes and 17 seconds to reach the defensive line. The heavy interdictors were the compact's most capable combat vessels short of a full cruiser, each one carrying weapons systems rated for engagement against equivalent or superior opposition, with hull reinforcement designed to sustain significant damage before mission capability was compromised. The 2 interdictors, the Graven Stand and the Deepwater Monitor, had a combined weapons output that exceeded anything in the Rimward Patrol Fleet's standard engagement profile. The interdictors were designed to stop things. The Graven Stand and Deepwater Monitor opened fire at maximum effective range, which in their operational doctrine meant engaging at a distance that maximized their own survivability while maintaining weapons effectiveness. This was a reasonable tactical choice. The abyssal compact was 4 kilometers and 600 meters long. Maximum effective range for compact interdictor weapons systems was approximately 30 kilometers. At 30 kilometers, the abyssal compact was not a point target, it was an area. The interdictors fired for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I tracked their weapons output carefully, and I can report that many of their shots struck the abyssal compact. I can also report that the abyssal compact's hull, which had spent 600 years in a gravity anchor trench below the ecliptic plane of a dead star system, showed no response to any of the impacts that I could detect on my sensor array. The hull plating absorbed the plasma strikes. The structural readings did not change. The reactor output did not fluctuate. The weapons housings continued to track. I watched 17 plasma impacts land on the forward hull section over the course of the first 90 seconds of the interdictor engagement, and the sensor data showed me nothing. No hull breach. No secondary explosion, no power fluctuation. The abyssal compact was being hit, and the abyssal compact did not register the fact in any way that my instruments could detect. The abyssal compact's response to the interdictors was measured. It was precisely the kind of response that I would later come to understand as characteristic of the vessel, not a response that expended more effort than the situation required, but a response that applied exactly the force necessary to address the specific threat. 2 weapon systems engaged simultaneously, one directed at each interdictor, and both interdictors were neutralized within approximately 90 seconds. The Gravenstand lost its propulsion system and its primary weapons array in a sequence that my sensor data recorded as two distinct hits separated by 11 seconds. The propulsion array first, then the weapons, suggesting either a targeting hierarchy that prioritized mobility before armament, or a weapons system accurate enough to address each system in sequence as a deliberate choice. The deepwater monitor was struck once, in the reactor housing, and went dark. The patrol fleet's frigate, the Old Survey, positioned between the two interdictors according to the defensive line formation, fired everything it had at a range of roughly 8 kilometers before the Abyssal Compact's attention reached it. The Old Survey fired for approximately 40 seconds. Then the Abyssal Compact's masked driver addressed the Old Survey, and the Old Survey's situation became substantially similar to the outer marks. The Orth Meridian was a full combat cruiser. I want to record this clearly because I believe it matters. The Orth Meridian was not a patrol vessel or a border frigate or a mid-range interdictor. It was a dedicated combat cruiser with weapons systems and hull reinforcement rated for sustained engagement against peer opposition. It had a crew of 440 trained combat specialists. Commander Vethosral commanded it with 19 years of experience, which is the same length of time I have been a scanner officer, which means he and I came up together in roughly the same period of the Compact's service, though in different specializations. I did not know him personally. I knew his record, which was excellent. The Orth Meridian engaged the Abyssal Compact at a range of approximately 22 kilometers and attempted a full-spectrum engagement, all available weapons systems firing simultaneously, with evasive course alterations at regular intervals to reduce its own targeting profile. This was correct doctrine. The Orth Meridian's weapons output was the highest of any vessel in the patrol fleet, and the simultaneous fire was intended to force the Abyssal Compact to address multiple threat vectors at once. The theory was sound. The Abyssal Compact made a course correction, a small one, perhaps 2 degrees of heading change, that brought it onto an angle of approach that positioned the Orth Meridian at the edge of its primary weapons envelope rather than directly in front of it. I did not understand this adjustment when I saw it. I understand it now. The Abyssal Compact was adjusting its approach angle so that the widest cross-section of its hull, 1 kilometer and 200 meters, presented to the Orth Meridian's weapons rather than the narrower profile of its bow or stern. The wider cross-section was more heavily armored. The Abyssal Compact was maneuvering to take the Orth Meridian's fire on the part of its hull best equipped to absorb it, while simultaneously bringing its own weapons to bear. It had assessed the Orth Meridian's weapons output, calculated the optimal armor angle, and made the course correction in the time it took me to note that a course correction had occurred. The navigation system, or whatever intelligence directed the navigation system, had done this automatically as a routine tactical geometry problem, the way I cross-reference a contact against the registry as routine. It was not difficult for it. That is the part I keep returning to. It was not difficult. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The Orth Meridian fired continuously throughout. The Abyssal Compact's hull continued to absorb the impacts. The Compact's weapons, the unidentified energy system, the mass driver, and at least 2 other systems I was only now beginning to fully resolve in my sensor data. Systems that had no entry in any Compact weapons catalog I had access to, addressed the Orth Meridian in a sequence that took, by my recording, 17 distinct firing solutions over the 4-minute engagement. Not 17 missed shots, not 17 systems targeting the same hull location repeatedly. 17 distinct, precisely aimed firing solutions at 17 distinct hull targets on the Orth Meridian, each one addressing a specific system, propulsion, then weapons clusters in order of output rating, then hull structural points, then communication systems, then finally, after everything else had been addressed, the reactor housing. The Orth Meridian's reactor failsafe triggered before a breach. I want to record this because I believe it is relevant to what happened to Commander Vethosral and his crew. The failsafe triggered, and the reactor shut down safely. The Orth Meridian was cold and dark and drifting when the abyssal compact passed it, but it was intact. 440 people in a ship with no power and no propulsion, but with hull integrity intact, drifting at a distance of approximately 18 kilometers from my position. The abyssal compact did not stop. It did not adjust its velocity. It continued on its heading, which was not a heading toward the nearest inhabited compact system, not toward any of the border colonies or way station clusters that populated this region of space, but toward the deep interior, toward the compact's core systems, toward the administrative centers and the inhabited worlds and the population concentrations that the Rimward Border Patrol existed, in theory, to protect. By my sensor data, the abyssal compact had been under engagement by the compact's patrol fleet for a total of 31 minutes, across multiple discrete engagements involving 7 patrol vessels. One of those vessels was destroyed. 4 were disabled. 1 was driven from the engagement by damage. The quiet ledger, which had not fired and had not been fired upon, remained functional. The abyssal compact had sustained no detectable damage to any system that appeared on my sensor array. Its reactor output was unchanged. Its weapons were still active. Its heading was unchanged. Its velocity had actually increased slightly during the engagements, which I believe was a function of the continued burn of its propulsion system rather than any specific tactical acceleration. I sat at my sensor station for a time after the last engagement ended. I'm not certain how long. The sensor array continued to log data automatically, so I have a record of the elapsed time, which was 11 minutes and 42 seconds, but 11 minutes and 42 seconds does not feel accurate to my memory of that period. It feels both shorter and much longer than that. Drathvel sat at her own station in complete silence. The rest of the Quiet Ledger's bridge crew did the same. No one gave orders. There were no orders to give. Then I began to write this report, because writing the report was the only thing I could think of to do that was not useless. I want to say something here about what it was like to watch the abyssal compact for the duration of the engagement. Not the tactical details, which I have already recorded, but what it was like to be the instrument through which those tactical details were observed. Because I am a scanner officer, and what I do is watch. And what I watched was something that I do not believe the compact's history of catalog and archive and 900 years of comprehensive institutional knowledge had prepared any of us to understand. The abyssal compact moved like something that had been moving for a very long time and had no reason to stop. Not quickly, not slowly, but continuously, at every moment during the engagement, at every moment during the 31 minutes in which 7 compact vessels attempted to address it, the abyssal compact was moving. Its course corrections were minimal. Its evasive maneuvers, if that is the right word. I am not certain they were evasive in intent rather than simply optimal in geometry, were not the urgent, sharp-angled burns of a vessel trying to avoid damage. They were the deliberate, efficient adjustments of a navigation system that understood exactly where it needed to be at every moment and was continuously positioning itself there. It moved like something navigating a known obstacle course rather than like something responding to a threat. And it was quiet in a way that I find difficult to describe. Combat, in my experience, has a kind of urgency to it. Even in sensor data, there is an immediacy, a density of events occurring in close sequence that creates the subjective impression of acceleration, of too much happening at once. The abyssal compact's engagement with the patrol fleet did not feel like that. It felt methodical. It felt like something addressing a sequence of items that needed to be addressed, one after another in the most efficient order. The weapons discharges came at intervals that were not hurried. There was nothing in the data that suggested the abyssal compact was under pressure, was responding to urgency, was making choices under constraint. It appeared to have all the time it needed. It appeared to have been operating under that assumption for a very long time. I thought about the registry entry while I was watching. I thought about the survey mission 603 years ago, the drone pass, the scan that showed no power output and no life signs and no active systems. I thought about the word decommissioned. I thought about the single entry in the file, one scan, one assessment, one classification, maintained unchanged for 600 years because there was no reason to revisit the file of a dead system containing what appeared to be an abandoned relic. The compact has been cataloging for 900 years. Our archive is comprehensive. Our archive is complete. These are things we say, and I have said them myself, not boastingly but as simple statements of institutional fact. We have a file on that. When something fits in the file, it stays in the file and the file is sufficient, and there is no need to look again. I thought about what the Abyssal Compact had been doing for 600 years. The survey mission had found it running on minimum power. Not dead. Minimum power. Running its systems at the lowest level capable of maintaining basic function. A level low enough that a sensor scan would read no meaningful output, would read the vessel as dark and cold and non-functional, would classify it as abandoned. 600 years of minimum power. 600 years of reactor output below the threshold of detection by a survey drone running a single pass over a dead system. 600 years of waiting. 600 years during which the compact's archive entry sat unchanged, and the dead system was noted as surveyed, and the file was closed and no one looked again, because the file said decommissioned, and decommissioned means finished, and finished means there is nothing left to watch. Waiting for what? I do not know. I do not have access to whatever understanding of time and circumstance led the Abyssal Compact's crew, if it had a crew. I detected no life signs, only systems, but systems that operated with a precision and adaptability that I cannot confidently attribute to automated function alone, to choose 600 years as the appropriate duration. I do not know what they had been waiting for. I know only that they had been waiting, and that the wait had apparently ended, and that the reason for the ending was not something I could read in the sensor data. The sensor data told me only what the Abyssal Compact was doing. It told me nothing about why, or what decision had been made in the dark below the ecliptic plane, in the cold of a gravity anchor trench in a dead star system, that transformed 6 centuries of patience into motion. What I could read in the sensor data was that every system on the Abyssal Compact was functioning exactly as designed. The propulsion system was performing within its original specifications. The weapons systems were performing within their original specifications. The hull, which had spent 600 years in a gravity anchor trench below the ecliptic plane of a dead star under conditions that should have corroded and stressed, and eventually destroyed its structural integrity, was performing within its original specifications. The Abyssal Compact was not diminished by 600 years of dormancy. It was not even aged. It was functioning as it had been designed to function, and it had been designed to function under conditions that the Compact's military assessment of 700 years ago had categorized as moderate capability, limited reach, no immediate threat posture. I looked at that old assessment for a long time. I found it in the historical archive while I was writing this report. The original assessment of human military capability from the period of the consolidation. 952 pages of detailed analysis by the Compact's most experienced military evaluators, including sensor data from direct observation of human vessels in the period, including weapons performance data extrapolated from observed engagements between human forces and other civilizations in the region, including engineering assessments of hull construction methodology and propulsion technology and weapons systems design. The assessment concluded, moderate capability, limited reach, no immediate threat posture. The assessment included a specific note regarding the Perdition-class dreadnought series, which it described as the most capable hull design in the human military's inventory at the time. The note assessed the Perdition class as heavily armed for its period and capable of sustained combat operation, but limited by its propulsion technology, its weapons range, and its hull reinforcement to engagement profiles that were effective against peer opposition and potentially effective against superior opposition under optimal conditions. It described the class as formidable in the context of human-scale conflicts, but not a match for compact combat cruisers in a direct engagement. The assessment was thorough. The assessment was well-reasoned. The assessment was based on accurate data from the period in which it was conducted. The assessment was also, as of approximately 31 minutes ago, demonstrably incomplete in a way that I believe no one who produced it could have anticipated, because the error in the assessment was not an error of analysis, but an error of assumption. The evaluators had assumed that a vessel in the condition the survey found it, minimum power, no active systems, no life signs, was a vessel in the condition it would remain. They had assumed that the state of a thing at the moment of observation was a reasonable guide to the nature of that thing over time. It is a reasonable assumption. It is the assumption that underlies the entire catalog. It is the assumption that makes the archive possible. What the assessment had not accounted for, could not have accounted for, because the evidence of it was buried in the gravity anchor trench below the ecliptic plane of a dead star, and would remain there for another 600 years, was the possibility that a Perdition-class dreadnought might not remain in the condition in which it was observed. That 6 centuries of what appeared to be dormancy might not be dormancy. That the vessel's systems, whatever intelligence directed them, human crew or something else, or the accumulated logic of 600 years of self-directed maintenance, had spent 600 years doing what any military force does when it is not fighting, studying, preparing, improving what could be improved within the hull's existing framework, with the materials at hand, in the dark and the cold, and the silence of a dead star system where no one was watching, because the file said decommissioned, and the archive was complete, and there was no reason to look again. 3 of the weapons systems I had been unable to identify or classify in the Abyssal Compact's firing profile were not in any version of the Compact's weapons catalog, not the current version, not historical versions, not the version that had been current when the Perdition class was assessed 700 years ago. They were not Perdition-class weapons. They were something the Abyssal Compact was carrying that no survey or assessment had ever documented, because no survey had ever looked at the Abyssal Compact while it was operational. Because the Compact's file said decommissioned, and the Compact's file was comprehensive, and there was no need to look again. The Abyssal Compact is currently on a heading toward the Compact's core systems. I have calculated its trajectory based on its current heading and velocity, and it is aimed, with a precision that suggests deliberate navigation rather than coincidence, at the Vorathketh Junction, the point where the rimward transit lanes converge into the main arterial routes that lead to the Compact's populated interior. At its current velocity, it will reach the Vorathketh Junction in approximately 9 days. It will reach the first heavily populated system in the interior in approximately 22 days. I have broadcast this report on all available channels, including the emergency frequency designated for situations that exceed the response capability of the local patrol fleet. I do not know how many vessels are currently within reception range. I do not know how many of those vessels are combat capable in any sense that will be relevant. I know that the Compact will respond, because the Compact always responds. 900 years of institutional function does not simply stop because a single contact has eliminated a patrol fleet in 31 minutes. The Compact will send more ships. Larger ships, coordinated formations rather than a patrol fleet distributed across a sector. The Compact will send everything it has available in this region and then call for more from the interior. and the response will be larger than anything that has ever been assembled along the rimward border, because the rimward border has never needed anything larger than what was already here. I find that I cannot assess what that response will accomplish. I have tried. I have looked at the data I have collected over the past several hours, the full sensor picture of the abyssal compact in operation, and I have tried to construct an honest technical assessment of what a military response would need to bring to bear in order to stop it. I cannot complete that assessment. Not because I lack the data, but because every time I attempt to construct it, I am confronted by the same problem. The assessment I keep building is based on what I have seen the abyssal compact do. And what I have seen the abyssal compact do is neutralize 7 compact combat vessels with no detectable damage to its own systems, while never appearing to operate above a level of effort that I can only describe as moderate. It never strained. It never accelerated beyond what was necessary. It addressed each threat with the minimum required response and continued on its way. I do not know what it looks like when the abyssal compact operates above the level it showed today. I do not know whether there is a level above what it showed today. I do not have that data. I only have what I saw. There is something else I need to record, because it belongs in the technical log even though it belongs equally in some other kind of document that scanner officers are not typically asked to produce. I need to record that watching the abyssal compact work was not like watching a weapons engagement. It was not like anything I have a professional category for. What it was like, and I record this with full awareness that it is not the kind of language that belongs in a sensor report, was watching something that was very old and very certain move through space the way water moves through a channel. Not aggressive, not triumphant, not in any hurry. Just moving, with the absolute assurance of something that understands exactly what it is and exactly what it is capable of, and has no need to demonstrate either. Because demonstration implies an audience whose opinion matters, and the abyssal compact does not appear to be operating under the assumption that any audience's opinion matters. The compact's patrol fleet, 7 vessels, combined weapons output that I have now calculated as approximately 40 times what the fleet in this region would deploy against any threat in our standard engagement profiles, was not a challenge to the abyssal compact. It was a pause, a brief operational delay, addressed and set aside. The Orth Meridian, which I have served near for 3 years and which carries the most experienced combat crew on the rimward border, was 17 distinct targeting solutions, and 4 minutes and 12 seconds of the abyssal compact's attention. And then the abyssal compact looked away and continued on its heading, and the Orth Meridian drifted cold and dark in the space behind it. And that was the sum total of the encounter from the abyssal compact's evident perspective. I keep thinking about the gravity anchor trench, the specific mechanics of it, how you position a vessel of that mass in a stable long-term orbit below the ecliptic plane of a dead star, how you configure the reactor for 600 years of minimum draw operation, without the kind of maintenance cycle that a live crew would perform, how you maintain weapon systems across that span without the corrosion and mechanical degradation that should, by every principle of engineering I am aware of, have rendered them non-functional long before today. The compact's engineers, if I transmitted this data to them right now, would tell me it is not possible. The hull alone should have failed. The gravity anchor trench would have subjected the structure to tidal stresses over 6 centuries that no hull in any class we have on record has been designed to sustain for that duration. The reactor should have degraded below minimum sustainable output within 200 years. The weapons systems should have been inert within 100. And yet, 4 kilometers and 600 meters of functioning, operational, weapons-active human dreadnought, currently crossing into compact territory, currently on a heading that it has not deviated from since it cleared the ecliptic plane, currently operating every system within original design specifications. Either the Perdition class was built to tolerances that the compact's assessments did not credit, or the abyssal compact spent 600 years maintaining itself, or both. Either answer changes the nature of the threat in ways that I do not believe the interior command structure has had any reason to anticipate. The assessment said moderate capability. The assessment was made by capable analysts examining accurate data. The assessment was wrong not because the analysts were wrong, but because the vessel in that gravity anchor trench was not finished becoming what it was going to be when the assessment was written, and nothing in the compact's institutional framework gave anyone reason to revisit the question. Moderate capability, that is what the assessment said. 603 years ago, when a compact survey drone passed over the gravity anchor trench, where the abyssal compact was running its systems at minimum power and waiting, a survey drone logged the contact as a decommissioned hulk and marked the file closed. The file is still there. I can access it from my station. It still says decommissioned. It has not been updated because the system that updates these files relies on survey returns, and no survey has returned to Voreth Null in 400 years, because the system was assessed as empty and there was nothing in it to survey. The file will probably be updated now. Someone in the compact's administrative structure will update the file to reflect the contact, the engagement, the outcome. They will mark the abyssal compact as active rather than decommissioned, and the update will be logged with today's date, and the archive will be adjusted to reflect the new information. I find this very funny, in a way that has nothing to do with humor. The quiet ledger is operational. My own systems are intact. I have power and navigation and full sensor capability. I am the only functional combat vessel in the sector, which is a statement that deserves some qualification. I am a border patrol frigate with a crew of 62 and weapons rated for interdicting civilian vessels and light security threats. I am not a combat asset in any meaningful sense in the context of what has just occurred. What I am is a witness. What I am is the instrument of observation that the compact's archive depends on, and I am performing that function to the best of my ability, which is the only thing left for me to do. I am watching the abyssal compact on my sensor array. It is now 24 minutes since the last engagement ended. The abyssal compact has not altered its heading. It has not reduced its velocity. It has not broadcast anything on any communication frequency in the entire period I have been observing it. It has simply continued. The way a very large, very heavy, very old thing continues when it has decided on a direction, and there is nothing between it and where it is going that has been sufficient to change its mind. There are several compact systems between the Voreth Null dead zone and the interior junction. They have populations. They have installations. They have patrol assets smaller and less capable than the assets that have just been addressed, because the assets that are larger and more capable are deployed inward, where the threats are assessed as higher, because the rimward border has always been quiet, because the rimward border is where the dead systems are, the empty boxes ticked, the closed files. I have broadcast the warning. I have transmitted the full sensor record. I have done the things that are within my capability to do from the position I am in with the resources I have. I will continue to transmit as long as the quiet ledger's communication systems function, and I will continue to watch as long as my sensor array can resolve the abyssal compact's position. This is my function. I perform it. I want to say one more thing before I close this report. When the abyssal compact cleared the last of Voreth Null's debris rings, and I had my first complete dimensional picture, I noted that the hull scoring and scarring was consistent with weapons damage from the consolidation period. Not recent damage from 600 years ago, the kind of damage a vessel sustains in sustained combat and does not fully repair because it is in the field and repair is secondary to function. The vessel had been in combat before it descended into the gravity anchor trench. It had been in combat, and it had descended, and it had waited, and what it had waited for had apparently now arrived or ended or resolved itself in a way that made the waiting unnecessary. It had come up from the deep with 600-year-old scars on its hull and weapon systems we had never catalogued, and a heading aimed at the interior of the compact's space, and it had not announced its presence, had not broadcast a declaration or an ultimatum or an explanation, had not done anything except rise and continue on its way. This is the part that I find most difficult to account for in a technical report, but which I believe is necessary to record because it pertains to operational intent. The abyssal compact has communicated nothing. In 31 minutes of engagement with 7 compact vessels, across multiple opportunities to broadcast on open frequencies, it transmitted nothing. Not a warning, not a demand, not an identification, nothing. Every civilization the compact has encountered in 900 years of catalog work has communicated before or during engagement. Declarations of intent, ultimatums, terms of surrender, identification protocols, something. Communication is what distinguishes a military action from a natural disaster. The compact's entire engagement doctrine assumes communication, because communication is the mechanism through which situations are assessed, through which miscalculations are corrected, through which conflicts that begin with a misunderstanding can end without total annihilation. The abyssal compact has offered no mechanism for correction. It has not misunderstood us. It has not failed to notice us. It engaged 7 of our vessels with precise, targeted, calibrated force designed specifically to disable rather than destroy in most cases, which implies an assessment of the engagement that is more sophisticated than simple aggression. It knows exactly what it is doing. It is simply not telling us what that is, or why, or whether there is a condition under which it would stop. The compact's command structure will want to know, is this an act of war or something else? I cannot answer that question. I can only record what my sensor array shows. The sensor array shows a vessel on a heading. The heading has not changed. The vessel has not stopped. Those are the facts I have. Everything else is interpretation, and the compact's archive has been interpreting this vessel for 600 years, and the interpretation was wrong. I do not know what it was waiting for. I do not know whether the 600-year dormancy was a tactical choice or a necessity or something else entirely. Something that does not translate into a category the compact's catalog covers. I do not know whether the abyssal compact's next action, after it reaches the interior, will be what I have seen it do here, or something different, or something that makes what I have seen here look moderate by comparison. I know only what the sensor data shows. The hull profile, 4 kilometers and 600 meters along its primary axis, moving on a constant heading at constant velocity toward the compact's core systems, the reactor running at full operational draw, the weapons active and tracking, the navigation system making small, precise, efficient adjustments, no urgency, no strain. The same pace it has maintained since it cleared the gravity anchor trench and rose through the ecliptic plane into the light of a cold, dead star, and continued, without pause, without announcement, without any indication that the 31 minutes in which it addressed 7 compact combat vessels constituted anything more than a minor operational requirement to be handled and set aside. And here is the thing that I keep returning to. The thing I cannot resolve into something more comfortable or more manageable or more amenable to the frameworks I have used for 19 years to understand what my sensor array tells me. The abyssal compact is moving at the same velocity now as it was before any of the engagements. The engagements did not slow it. The engagements did not alter its heading. The engagements did not, as far as I can determine from the sensor data, register as significant events in whatever calculus governs its operation. The patrol fleet was a delay of 31 minutes. That is all it was. 31 minutes and 7 vessels, and I do not know how many lives. And the abyssal compact is at the same velocity on the same heading, with the same reactor output, and the same weapons profile as if none of it had happened at all. It does not know the catalog is there, or if it does, it has not adjusted its heading. The Compact's archive has an entry for the Abyssal Compact. It says decommissioned. It has said decommissioned for 600 years. In 9 days, the Abyssal Compact will reach the Vorethketh Junction. In 22 days, it will reach the first heavily populated system in the interior. And somewhere in the Compact's administrative structure, someone will update the file. I have been a scanner officer for 19 years. I log what I see. The sensor array does not editorialize, does not interpret beyond the data, does not add weight or meaning to a reading that the reading does not contain. I have tried in this report to be as accurate as the sensor array is, to record what I observed without overstating it or understating it, to give whoever receives this transmission a complete and reliable account of what happened in the Voreth system today, so that the decisions that follow can be made with full information, rather than with the partial information that a decommissioned file entry represents. What I observed was this: a vessel the archive classified as inert rose from a gravity-anchor trench in a dead star system and addressed 7 combat-capable compact vessels in 31 minutes without taking damage and without altering its heading. It is currently on course for the interior. It has not communicated. It has not stopped. It shows no sign of intending to do either. I will keep watching until I cannot.